When my son came running into the house that afternoon, tears streaking down his dusty face, I thought he had fallen off his bike or maybe been picked on by some of the kids down the street. But when I followed him outside and saw what that woman had done, what that entitled, cruel neighbor had thought was perfectly acceptable, I felt something inside me snap. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt, and a wave of heat spread through my body so fast it almost made me dizzy. My son's backpack, his pride and joy because it had patches sewn on from the base his grandfather had served at, was hanging from a thick branch of the old oak tree in the middle of the HOA's shared green space. The straps were twisted into a cruel knot, dangling like some sick trophy, and there was Karen standing with her hands on her hips, smirking like she'd just done the world a favor. "Maybe now he'll learn some respect," she said, loud enough for every neighbor out walking their dog to hear. My son, just 11 years old, buried his face in my side, sobbing from the humiliation. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was devastated, broken in a way that hit me deeper than anything else ever had. And in that moment, I knew two things for certain. First, this had gone too far. This wasn't just another petty HOA complaint, another nasty email about lawn length or garbage bins. This was her targeting my family, my child. Second, she had no idea who she had just messed with. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm building inside me, but the fury was too sharp. I could barely hear anything over the pounding in my ears. My neighbors froze, caught between shock and fear, because everyone knew Karen ruled this HOA like a tyrant. She had fined people into bankruptcy for minor infractions, bullied families into moving, and made herself the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. Most of them stayed silent out of fear. But me? I had a different kind of backbone. One Karen had no idea existed. I untied the backpack and handed it back to my son. He clutched it like it was life itself. I crouched to his level and whispered, "Go inside, buddy. This isn't your fight." His watery eyes met mine, filled with confusion, but he obeyed, walking quickly back toward the house. As soon as he was out of earshot, I straightened and faced Karen. "You think humiliating a child makes you powerful?" I said, my voice low and steady. She scoffed. "If you raised him better, I wouldn't have to teach him lessons. Maybe this neighborhood will finally be civilized if people like you learn to follow the rules." Every word was like gasoline on the fire inside me, but instead of shouting, instead of lunging at her the way my instincts screamed to, I just smiled. Not a kind smile, a cold, sharp one that made her smirk falter for the briefest second. And then I turned and walked back into my house without another word. Because while Karen thought she had won, she didn't realize she had just declared a war she couldn't possibly comprehend. See, Karen didn't know my background. She didn't know who my husband was. She didn't know what resources we had access to. She thought we were just another suburban family she could intimidate with HOA fines and nasty letters. But less than 2 minutes after I closed my front door, the sky above our neighborhood would tell her otherwise. Inside the house, my son was curled up on the couch, clutching his backpack. His little shoulders shook as he tried to stop crying. I sat beside him, stroking his hair, and I whispered, "You're safe. You're strong, and she will never hurt you again." I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I rarely used unless it was truly important. My husband had been deployed for months, and while he couldn't just come home whenever he wanted, there were protocols, connections, and signals we had in place for emergencies. This wasn't about breaking military rules. This was about sending a message. And I knew exactly who to call to make that message loud and clear. The line clicked, and a familiar voice answered. "Ma'am?" "It's me," I said. My voice trembled with suppressed fury. "We have a situation at home. I need a demonstration. Nothing dangerous, nothing over the line, but visible, clear, immediate." There was no hesitation on the other end. "Understood." When I hung up, I felt a strange calm wash over me. Not relief, not yet, but the steady kind of calm that comes when you know justice is finally on its way. Outside, Karen was still barking at neighbors, telling them how unruly kids were a menace, how the HOA had to take a stand. She relished the sound of her own voice, oblivious to what was about to unfold above her. Then, it began. At first, it was a low thrum in the distance, the kind of sound that makes the hair on your arms stand up before your brain even registers it. Dogs started barking. Birds scattered from the trees. The ground itself seemed to hum. And then the unmistakable roar of rotor blades filled the air, growing louder, closer, heavier. Karen's smug expression froze as shadows rippled across the street. Neighbors looked up, shielding their eyes from the sun, as 3 massive military helicopters swept in over the rooftops, circling low. The noise was deafening, the wind from the blades whipping leaves and debris into the air. Curtains flapped violently in open windows. People gasped, pointed, some even ducked instinctively. And Karen? She stumbled back, her face draining of color, as her perfectly styled hair whipped wildly around her head. The helicopters hovered directly above the green space, powerful searchlights cutting through the daylight as if to pin Karen in place. The message was clear. Someone in this neighborhood had crossed a line, and the response was overwhelming, undeniable, impossible to ignore. I stepped outside with my son by my side, his small hand gripping mine tightly. His tears had dried, replaced by awe. His eyes were wide, reflecting the gleam of the helicopters, as if he suddenly understood that he wasn't powerless, that his family was protected in ways most kids could only dream of. Karen staggered forward, shouting over the deafening roar. "What is this? What's going on?" I didn't answer right away. I just let the spectacle sink in, let her flounder in confusion and fear as the whole neighborhood stared. Finally, I raised my voice enough to cut through the chaos. "This is what happens," I said, "when you target my family. This is what happens when you think humiliating a child makes you untouchable. Consider this your final warning, Karen." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Her usual arsenal of insults and threats failed her. For the first time, she was speechless, and that silence in front of the entire neighborhood was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. The helicopters hovered another few moments, long enough for everyone to understand this wasn't some random flyover. This was deliberate, purposeful, and then, just as suddenly as they had arrived, they pulled back, rising higher, banking away, and disappearing over the horizon. The silence that followed was almost as loud as their arrival. Everyone stood frozen, processing what they'd just witnessed. Karen looked around desperately, but no one came to her defense. Not one neighbor stepped in to reassure her. She had ruled this neighborhood with fear for years, but in that moment she looked small, pathetic, and completely alone. I turned to my son and squeezed his hand. "Let's go inside, buddy. We're done here." As we walked back to our house, I caught the eyes of several neighbors. Some gave me small nods of respect. Others smiled faintly, relief written across their faces. They knew what had just happened wasn't just about me or my son. It was about all of them. Karen's reign of terror had ended in the most public, undeniable way possible. That night, as I tucked my son into bed, he whispered, "Mom, I wasn't scared when the helicopters came." I felt proud. His little face glowed with a confidence I hadn't seen before. And that's when I knew this wasn't just revenge. This was healing. Karen never tried to mess with us again. In fact, she avoided us completely, her once loud voice now reduced to bitter mutters behind closed doors. Word spread quickly, and soon enough her influence over the HOA crumbled. People stopped taking her seriously. Her threats lost their edge. And though she still lived in the neighborhood, she was no longer the tyrant she once was. Some might say I went too far, that involving the military, even in a symbolic show of force, was extreme. But here's the truth. Sometimes bullies only understand strength. Sometimes the only way to stop someone who thrives on fear is to show them a fear greater than themselves. And in the end, it wasn't about intimidation. It was about restoring my son's dignity, proving to him that no one, not even the loudest, most entitled Karen, could strip him of his worth. So if you've ever been pushed around, belittled, or humiliated by someone who thought they had power over you, remember this: you are stronger than they realize. And sometimes justice comes roaring in from the sky, louder and more undeniable than they could ever imagine. And if this story gave you chills, smash that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me in the comments what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed. Because one thing's for certain, karma has impeccable timing, and sometimes it arrives on rotor blades.